From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Inside Politics from Please Explain. I'm Jacqueline Maley. It's Friday, August 17. Today, Labor's National Conference officially begins. Held in Brisbane over 2 days, it's Labor's first face-to-face national conference in 5 years. Labor heavyweights will mingle with grassroots members and the sound of the Internationale being sung at top voice will ring through the Brisbane streets. Maybe. We'll see. For now, what we do know is about 2,000 Labor politicians, party members and unionists are meeting to discuss some of the most important issues in our politics right now. The Voice, housing, AUKUS and the climate, to name a few. So what exactly is the point of Labor's National Conference? Is it all just a bit of theatre, or will some true tensions within the party be aired in public? And what will it mean for the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, whose popularity is slipping following fierce political dispute over The Voice? Today, National Affairs Editor James Massola and Chief Political Correspondent David Crowe join me, phoning in from National Conference in Brisbane to discuss the week in politics. Welcome, David and James.
Great to be talking again, Jackie, and actually great to be in beautiful Brisbane for the Labor conference, I've got to say. Warm, fantastic.
A bit of a change from Canberra, David, and yeah, good to be with you, Jack.
So you both flew in to Brisbane earlier this week to attend Labor's National Conference. James, can you set the scene for us as atmospherically as possible? Who is there? Where is it? What are they doing? What's the atmosphere like?
Yeah, so we're at the Brisbane Convention Centre, right on the river on South Bank. There's 402 delegates, 399 of them get a vote. We've got basically 2.5 days, Jack, of debate over everything from the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal to housing policy, to discussions about The Voice, to the sometimes arcane rules debate, which we see Saturday afternoon when most people have kind of had enough, where they debate, who should be on the national executive, the votes are tallied, those sorts of things. The first in-person conference for Labor since 2018, which was in Adelaide. We're not expecting too many fireworks. The nuclear subs deal will be something that will be a flashpoint, but these things tend to be pretty carefully managed, and the kind of flashpoints, if you like, a lot of it's hammered out beforehand, although there are exceptions like the 2015 conference in Melbourne where there was a big showdown on Labor's stance on turning back asylum seeker boats.
David, given what James says, that a lot of it is stitched up beforehand, sort of in the privacy of backroom deals, what exactly is the point of Labor's National Conference? It's supposed to set the party's policy platform, but is it all just a bit of theatre? Will anything actually get decided there?
I think things will be decided, and what we've had so far is a lot of media coverage of things that are going to be debated, trying to get ahead of those debates, but you don't really know how it's going to unfold until you're in the room and you're seeing people speak. And the attitude I bring to this conference is it's not just about the vote in the end, because we know that generally the Prime Minister's own faction, the left, will support him, and the right faction has a tradition of supporting the leader. So he's going to get the numbers in the end. The right alone has about 45% of the votes here. So that's the vote in the end, but we've got to watch the debate. It's important for all political parties to have debate about the direction, and that's what this conference is important for. AUKUS, climate change, economic policy, stage 3 tax cuts, all these things can come up for debate, and you can get rising stars in the Labor movement saying their piece if they're willing to take on some of the ministers and be a bit edgy. That's what we'll have to wait for. But I think also there's something else that's happening here. The message from Anthony Albanese to set up this meeting in his opening remarks was all about, we've delivered the things that we've put in the platform in the past, we're putting into practice as government.
Delegates, from our first day in office, my colleagues and I have made it very clear that we're not here to just occupy the space. We are determined to make every day count, to make a difference. And just as importantly, we are in this for the long haul, the long term.
We have to take Australians with us on the journey. We have to be a long-term Labor government.
That's why it's vital we leave this conference with a plan for progress over the next decade and a platform for victory in 2025.
So that's his message. Sure, let's have a debate, but don't rock the boat so much that you're going to make us unelectable at the next election. We want to be a long-term Labor government, stay disciplined. That's his message to the troops here.
So it's almost a political message rather than a policy message, or it's very much that, and it's pitched towards the next election, which is interesting. James, at the last conference in 2021, which took place over Zoom, there seemed to be almost total unity among the party, and our colleague Sean Kelly wrote in his column earlier this week that there was furious agreement, which he found infuriating because these conferences are supposed to be a place for ideas to be debated. So do you think that this conference will be any different, or will it be sort of furious agreement all over again?
No, look, I think it'll have a lot more. I mean, it already has a lot more life than we saw in 2021, which is arguably the most stage-managed conference in the history of the Labor Party. Thank you very much, pandemic and Zoom. I mean, we've already seen a big CFMEU protest.
This is the CFMEU protesting, and they're taking their message to the convention centre where the Labor conference is being held.
They're, of course, a key Labor union. They're not really so much criticising the Labor government, but saying, we want more. I was out there listening to Zach Smith, who's one of the stars, rising stars of the movement, you know, one of the guys who you might see in Parliament in 5 or 10 years' time, and who's making a name for himself now. They're pushing for Labor to have a much more ambitious housing policy, and obviously we've seen a lot from the PM and the states as recently as yesterday.
We're also calling on the government to impose a super profits tax, the proceeds of which would go to fund social and affordable housing in this country.
Zach, thanks for your time.
They want a super profits tax. Now, I don't think that's going to be bedded down at this conference. I don't think it's going to happen. But what conference does is function as a kind of pressure release valve and an ideas forum. You know, it's an iterative process, and you inject them into the public debate in the fora of the party.
Yeah, that makes sense. David, as you just alluded to before, National Conference and Labor itself has in the past been controlled by the right faction. But this time they have a man from the left in charge, Anthony Albanese. So how does that change the dynamics of the conference, if it does indeed change the dynamics of the conference?
It's part of a long-term shift, really, which is the Labor base becoming more progressive in many ways. And you can see that with individual votes from individual branches. We've seen branches in the lead up to this conference vote against the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal. I mean, this is a key policy of the Labor government, and yet we've got branch members saying they don't want nuclear submarines or nuclear-powered submarines. Now, that's a really vexed one for the leadership to deal with, and Richard Marles, as Defence Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, has been negotiating that through. So these become really tricky issues. Mind you, it's always tricky. I mean, back in the 70s, Labor had to deal with a three mines policy on how much uranium it would allow to be mined in Australia. So historically, it's always tricky. But I do think that the left has been quite assertive at the branch level on these issues around national security. We're also seeing stage 3 tax cuts being criticised from the branches and from some in the Labor movement. And so that's a delicate one for Anthony Albanese and his ministers to manage. But they are effectively managing it so far to make sure that there's a discussion, there's a debate. Sometimes that debate occurs outside the conference itself because there are fringe events held. So I don't think it will lead to votes on the conference floor that shift the platform in a dramatic way. And in fact, on AUKUS, I expect the outcome to be a vote from the conference floor that effectively endorses AUKUS with some caveats, with some provisos, in a lengthy statement that's attached to the Labor platform. So, it's not all about, challenging the government and shifting its direction. It's about these long-term debates that are held sometimes on the sidelines of the conference itself, where there's furious networking, emerging stars, state their claim, and debates are set up for the future on things like tax, social policy, and so forth.
And David, do you think anything meaningful will actually come out of the conference? I'm talking about sort of stuff that is of broader interest to perhaps the listeners of this podcast that will make a difference to me and you, to the Australian public. Why should we pay attention to National Conference?
I do think that will happen. And I know it's fashionable for journalists to look at this and say it's all stage-managed theatre. And a lot of the opening is stage-managed theatre. But take climate, for instance. There will be messages from the conference floor, from unions saying, yes, you've got a target of net zero by 2050, and you've got a target of 43% cut to emissions by 2030, but your current policies do not do enough to get us there. Now, it'll vary in terms of how bolshy they are with that message, but they are sending that message to the government. So that puts pressure on the government to go further than the $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund or the Safeguard Mechanism or the $2 billion that's set aside to offer a subsidy for hydrogen, which is a potentially cleaner fuel. So that kind of message can't be ignored. It's there from the base. The government's got to, listen to it and then adjust policy accordingly. We can't predict exactly what specific policy emerges, but it is important for the direction of a government, and it will have an impact on future policy.
James, I want to segue quickly to The Voice now. The Labor Party has flagged that it will discuss The Voice to Parliament at National Conference on Saturday, and they've referred to this discussion as a springboard into its Yes campaign, which might be surprising to some people listening because it feels kind of late to have a springboard into the Yes conversation. The referendum is supposed to be held in less than 2 months. What's the thinking behind this?
I think it's about building a sense of momentum. So we still expect October 14, that's the widely tipped date. We still think that's the most likely date for the referendum. There's a 4-week parliamentary sitting period gap leading up to that, which would give the Prime Minister and his team, that kind of 4-week window. He's talked about a 4-week style election campaign blitz. It's a little bit more complicated because there's some overseas travel that the PM has to do in that period of time. So we might have a scenario, David and I were talking about this the other day, where he announces it, then he has to go to, I think it's Indonesia, the Philippines, India, and then sort of circle back and really take up the cudgels, if you like. But I think what we're going to see is an escalation over the next month and a half, 2 months of the campaign. And there has to be, because, as every published opinion poll is showing, particularly the Resolve poll, our poll, there is a steady downwards trajectory in support of The Voice, and to save it, to get it over the line, to get that double majority of states and the national vote, there needs to be some kind of circuit breaker, or at least a sense of momentum rising to a crescendo to convince people that this is a reform worth embracing.
David, as James just said, support for The Voice is steadily dropping in every published poll, including our own. And Anthony Albanese's popularity is very much descending in concert with it. Is this whole Yes debate just deteriorating for the Prime Minister?
I think it has been in recent weeks. The timing of our survey is, I think, a key fact. We did the survey from Wednesday to Sunday of last week, and that was after 2 weeks of Parliament where Peter Dutton, as opposition leader, was really getting stuck into the government.
At Garma this weekend, will the Prime Minister tell participants that despite last year giving them, and I quote, a solemn promise to implement the Uluru Statement from the heart in full, through Makarrata treaty-making and truth-telling, his position is now, as he told ABC Radio yesterday, that he has no plans and sees no need for a national treaty. Is the Prime Minister's problem one of competency, or does he just say whatever he thinks people want to hear?
Latching on to what I think is a bit of a conspiracy theory out there that the Uluru Statement is more than one page, that there's all this secret agenda behind it. But also, I think a key factor was the fact that the government didn't have a clear message when confronted with the question, does this mean a treaty? Does voting for The Voice mean all these other things? I think the Yes side has been a bit blurry with its message on some of these issues, and that's been messy. And it's cost Anthony Albanese personally, and it's cost the government. The other thing, and I think the government's well aware of it, and you can see what they're planning in the next couple of weeks, because there's so much debate on The Voice, people think the government's not getting on with focusing on the other issues like cost of living. And I think that's something that's really costing the government. So that's a very difficult thing to balance, and it's got a lot of political risks all around.
It does, and I think we'll talk about those on a separate podcast because they're kind of fascinating. For now, I just want to segue quickly to Wednesday's National Cabinet, which, speaking of pressing cost of living issues, it was kind of all about this proposal to come up with a national plan for rental and housing stress. And the PM promised he would do that with the agreement of the states and territories. David, what did he end up delivering?
I think it's important to have a look at the outcome here because it was bigger than some thought beforehand.
That's why National Cabinet has agreed to an ambitious new national target to build 1.2 million new well-located homes over 5 years from the 1st of July 2024. This is an additional 200,000 new homes above the National Housing Accord target agreed by states and territories last year. The Commonwealth is committed.
It involves a $3 billion fund for the states and territories to give them an incentive to get cracking on a housing accord that's meant to have 1.2 million homes built over 5 years from 2024. That's not an instant fix to the shortage of housing and to rising rents, but it is an interesting sign of an incentive payment. So Canberra accepts that it's got to pay money to the states to get them cracking on reforms that everybody thinks are going to help here, which are things like planning and zoning, speeding up approval, getting more construction done. Some of the reaction to that, or most of the reaction to that, has been broadly positive. It also outlined principles on renters' rights.
National Cabinet has agreed to a better deal for renters to harmonise and strengthen renters' rights across Australia. This includes developing a nationally consistent policy to implement a requirement for genuine reasonable grounds for eviction, moving towards limiting rent increases to once a year, phasing in minimal rental standards. These changes will make a tangible impact.
And here the outcome is far more mixed because it's really only a statement of principle. And a specific question to Anthony Albanese at the press conference in Brisbane after this National Cabinet meeting was, well, what's the deadline? And he said as soon as possible. So it's a bit vague as to when it would have an effect, when it would all become uniform law across the country. And the fact is some of the states already ban no grounds evictions and already limit rent increases to once a year. So that's where the government's exposed to this full-on attack from the Greens saying you're not protecting renters enough, you must do more, you've got to cap rents or even freeze them nationwide, something that, some economists think simply won't work. But the point is the pressure from the Greens is unrelenting on this front, and we don't know yet whether that will snare voters from Labor, shift them to the Greens at the next election. Housing is becoming a bigger and bigger issue.
James, just on that point very quickly, the Greens have already come out and said how unhappy they are that Albanese didn't impose rental caps, not that he was ever going to impose rental caps because he signalled that he wouldn't. But the big question is, will the Greens now support the government's housing bill, even though they didn't get what they wanted in their negotiations?
I struggle to see it happening, Jack, at this stage. There's a bit of water to flow under the bridge yet still, but my sort of starting point in understanding this issue in terms of the politics of it, I think of the Australian National University's post-election survey. They've done this after every election, or almost every election, going back to the 70s. It found, this stat always gets me, 37% of renters in Australia voted Labor at the last election, 26% voted Liberal, 24% voted Green. So they are playing to their base, and they are playing to a base that is growing because more and more people can't afford to buy a home. They can only afford to rent. So by taking a hardline position and pushing Labor and pushing Labor and pushing Labor, they are speaking to a growing cohort of people who potentially offer a significant electoral dividend, and they would argue as well good policy and societal outcomes by limiting, rent increases to once per year. The ACT, I think, has capped annual rent increases to 10%. Those are the sorts of things they want to see rolled out nationally. It's a devil of a task for Anthony Albanese to get all the states to agree to that, as David said that he didn't manage it. I struggle to see it happening. So in the meantime, it's fertile ground for the Greens to harvest votes in.
Yep, and maybe no joy for Labor on its signature housing bill, and a bit of a game of chicken over a double dissolution election, which we will look forward to discussing at a future date. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I'll let you get back to the conference floor to rub shoulders with those union delegates, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Jack.
Cheers, Jackie. Back to the coffee queue for me.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Jacqueline Maley. This is Inside Politics from Please Explain. Thank you for listening.